Assassin's Creed is a franchise I've had a long history with at this point. I remember my first introduction to the series, being charmed by Ezio's charisma and enthralled with beautiful Italia. Ever since then I've been a loyal fan, but I haven't always gotten what I've wanted out of the games. For every Assassin's Creed 2, there was a Unity. But I've managed to stick with the series to this point, 3 games into the complete overhaul that Ubisoft did of the franchise, starting with Origins in 2017. Origins for me was a nice change of pace and a quality title for being an almost brand new game at that point. As for its sequel, my near 200-hour playthrough of Odyssey can summarize my enjoyment better than I could. But that brings us to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the third game of this new era. Does it reach the legendary heights of Ezio and Cassandra, or is it lost in the Norwegian fog with the likes of Rogue and Syndicate? Let's find out.
The glory we brought to that fractured land. So to England, glory and destiny.
To England!
To England! For Valhalla!
Before detailing the game's presentation, it's worth noting that I played this game on the PS4 Slim. Those with next-gen consoles and PCs, your mileage may vary. Now, this game is in many ways objectively prettier than the previous two. Textures and lighting are more detailed, the fire actually looks like fire, and it's generally a more realistic looking game. Even on last-gen hardware, the game looked and ran great the majority of the time. There are minor visual glitches such as clipping anatomy, texture pop-in, lip-sync issues, and mid-level loading, and while they do break immersion, they're nothing too crucial. I did encounter one very annoying gameplay glitch, but we'll get into that later, cause not all is well in the visual department. I'll be honest, the first area of the game is straight up boring. It is boring to explore, it is boring to look at, and it honestly sets the game off on a very bad note in my opinion. However, it does give me new insight into the creation of black metal. If all I had was lifeless snow-capped mountains to look at, I'd be pretty angry too. I actually had to force myself to push past this initial area, but I'm glad I did. Once you move out of Norway and head to the shores of England, the game becomes much more fun. The environment is more colorful, varied, with generally more to do. The aesthetic of this game also shines in a few story moments where the imagery becomes particularly dark and visceral. But I can't help but still feel disappointed. Origins and Odyssey had beautiful, vibrant color palettes, and this settles for something that's just more dull. But aesthetics aren't everything, and as is standard for Assassin's Creed, voice acting, music, and sound effects are all top-notch. That is when they work properly. There were numerous instances where characters talked over each other, sound effects triggered late, if they triggered at all, and the music was replaced with silence. There's also this ominous stuttering that happens when you quit the game that gave me chills, making me think my save file was corrupted. But thankfully that was never the case. When the audio works, the voices are stellar, the sound effects are satisfying, and the music sets the tone well. The music during exploration is particularly interesting, as it's mostly comprised of ambient bells and chimes. But enough about the cover, let's get into the story. In Valhalla, you play as Eivor, a member of the Raven clan who starts off trying to avenge the death of his family by hunting down their killer. Not too long after this, him and his brother Sigurd set off to colonize the land of tea and crumpets. In typical Assassin's Creed fashion, this journey leads you to the land of the gods in an attempt to save the world from the oppressive Templars. And of course, you can choose to play the female in this story. I chose to play the male character, Eivor. For the modern-day story, Layla Hassan is still the protagonist, and she has been contacted by Animus veterans Sean and Rebecca. After her incident at the gates of Atlantis, Sean and Rebecca give her the coordinates to a secluded cabin in New England, where Eivor's body currently rests. There, they plan to help Layla stave off the call to violence from the staff of Hermes, as well as protect Earth from the latent effects of the coronal mass ejection that killed Desmond 8 years earlier. I hope you understood all that, because I'm not even sure I did. As I'm sure many of you have as well, I tend to tune out the modern-day narrative of Assassin's Creed and have done so for many of the games now. There's not much I can say without spoiling certain events, but I can say that the pacing of this story is much slower than the more recent entries, which for me is a bummer. There's a lot of meddling in the early hours with vague prophecies and alliances. Eivor himself seems to lack motivation once he avenges his family, and the player isn't narratively driven to continue. But I can't read, so enough about the story. How does it play? While this might be unfair, I can't help but compare this game to its predecessor, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and to God of War PS4. Valhalla seemingly tries to combine the best of both, but ends up not matching up to either. Odyssey to me was responsive and arcadey. Valhalla sacrifices this to achieve a more realistic and brutal feeling combat system. And while the executions that are new to the game, which now feature dismemberments and beheadings, are satisfying to pull off, they don't hold a candle to any combat scenario in God of War PS4. The skill tree in the game is humongous, but apart from a handful of actual skills, it's mostly comprised of arbitrary stat boosts. This leads to another disappointing aspect of the gameplay loop. In Odyssey, there was countless gear to experiment with and find an effective loadout that you can consistently upgrade. Seemingly every combat scenario gave you something new. But in Valhalla, gear is much more scarce, leading you to simply upgrade your old equipment and supplement it with stat boosts. This sadly takes out an enjoyable layer of the game that results in a skill tree as vast as the ocean, but as deep as a puddle.
What they must think of me.
The dialogue trees that were introduced in the last game have returned, but I can't really tell if they make any difference in the quest lines or the story. While many side missions offer multiple dialogue options, only options with symbols make any difference in terms of how the mission plays out. Other than that, every mission ends the exact same no matter what dialogue you chose. The way this game approaches side quests has also changed. In previous entries, you talked to an NPC, they gave you an objective, then each step was marked on your map until you finished. Valhalla instead forces you to pay attention to the NPC conversation, listening for specifics like locations and actions. This is because side quests are no longer added to your quest log and cannot be tracked. And as far as I could tell, there was no setting to change this. While I can see how many players would enjoy this more open-ended style of side quests, I personally found them to be more work than they were worth. Raiding villages and enemy camps is now a major part of this game, and it honestly feels pretty great to pull off. However, I can't help but compare it to another game where raids were a lot more strategic and far more epic. That game being Middle-earth: Shadow of War. In that game, you chose the units who join you in your conquest, whether they be ranged, close combat, or legendary powerhouses. But in Valhalla, all your soldiers are essentially the same, and as long as you're not under-leveled, the raid will be a success. This made them seem quite repetitive after a while. Another gripe I have with the gameplay loop is that enemies no longer scale with you. There will be missions or areas that you will have to grind to in order to reach the appropriate level. And while this didn't affect my playthrough too much, it's not my preference and it does hinder exploration slightly. But one of the most disappointing parts of this game is the lack of any ship combat. While naval battles weren't as common for Vikings as they were for the Greeks, it would have still been nice to see some opportunities to board enemy ships or even team up for a raid on land. But to completely cut the feature after it becoming a series mainstay was sad to see. Any travel by boat in this game is rendered useless, unless you really like sea shanties. Despite my critiques, the moment-to-moment gameplay was fun enough to keep me going, and while this is clearly not my favorite Assassin's Creed, it is a worthwhile title that highlights Ubisoft experimenting with their typical formula, which in itself should be commended. If you're a fan of the series, you'll likely enjoy Valhalla. If you've yet to try any of the games in this series and are debating on jumping in, I'd suggest this game at a price drop. It'll likely be $30 to $40 in no time, and I'd recommend picking it up then. If you want a number rating, I'd give it a 7. If you prefer stars, I'd say 3.5. If you're on the metric system, I'd say 25 kilos. But what do I know? Just play it for yourself, nerd.
Thank you for your help. You did not have to do this.
Kind and courageous people live the best lives. But it can be a difficult path to keep. So, what will you do now that this task is done?
Done? That was to announce my arrival. Now I leave this world. Enjoy your life. To Asgard!
What? Wait!
Thank you!